Welcome to the Contagious Code Podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I'm Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and more. Today is an historic day for the Contagious Code Podcast because it's the beginning of our Founder and CEO series. In this series, we're going to talk to absolute leaders and brilliant people, founders, co-founders, CEOs in the tech industry. People like Guillermo Rauch from Vercel, David Khurshid from Stately, Chris Coyier from CodePen, Brandon Bayer from Flight Control. I could go on and on. Gabe Greenberg from G2I, Vitaly Friedman from Smashing Magazine. Like, just absolutely brilliant people. And I have the privilege of speaking to them in some appreciable duration of time. And we have the privilege together of learning from them. So do not take this for granted. Do not take this lightly and come on this journey. This is so exciting. Another piece of news that I'm really happy to announce is that the Contagious Code Podcast has been going so well that we're now switching to a twice weekly schedule. What that means is Monday is mainline day, and that's the day for the Founder and CEO series. Thursday is the day for expert guests who are building great things at work, really brilliant developers as well. People like Shruti Kapoor from Slack, Jeff Escalante from Clerk, and a number of other absolutely gifted people. Rizal Scarlett from TBD, just a number of really great people. So stay tuned for that. If you haven't yet subscribed, I encourage you to subscribe. This is going to get really good and really intense. Today, we start our Founder and CEO series with a friend of mine, a fellow investor, and just an absolute brilliant human being, an everyday developer who's also a business person, Mathias Biilmann from Netlify. Mathias is the co-founder of Netlify. Like he co-started Netlify with Chris Bach many years ago. Netlify, for those of you who aren't initiated, is an excellent serverless hosting provider. They pioneered the term Jamstack. They literally invented the term Jamstack that is now popular on the web. Netlify has recently acquired Gatsby. Netlify invented the GitHub-oriented workflow where to deploy your website, you get pull request previews and you can merge. They invented that. That didn't exist before. They created a software-level router and CDN to get your traffic to your users as efficiently as possible. And we go into the details of that in this episode. Like, we talk about Merkle trees and how they deploy previews in a reliable way that scales to literally thousands and maybe even millions of users today. We go into all of the details of this, but we also talk about the journey to building Netlify. Like, how did you start it? We ask this of Matt. And, he mentions there's some resistance in the beginning because people maybe don't know what the product is, and waiting for the right stage to start listening has been key for him. Because if you start listening too early, before people even know what it is, they're going to tell you it's a bad idea, right? I will let him explain that, but I found that particularly insightful that he says you can't accept all feedback early. You have to find the right time to accept feedback, and then you have to curate what feedback you listen to and when. So lots of tips in there for if you're thinking of starting something, if you maybe are a founder or want to be a founder. There's takeaways there. There's takeaways on the technical details of Netlify. And finally, we talk about DDoS protection and how Netlify takes care of their customers. We also talk about DevRel. We talk about bottom up, that is either starting with the everyday developer and going for enterprise later, or top down, going for enterprise and big companies and then going to developers. And, to some degree, Matt's answers sometimes are just like, I don't know, man, because he mentions taking an iterative approach and figuring it out as you go. And this gives me a huge appreciation for Matt. Like, the man is an everyday developer, really. Very casual, very kind, very humble, and it was just a really insightful discussion. So with that, I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did, and I'm sure my joy in this discussion is contagious. Like, you should be able to feel it. Now, I'd like to offer this to all of you at zero cost. Unfortunately, there are costs involved here, and the whole reason we can even have this podcast, because it's separate to my job and other work, is through sponsors. This podcast, is sponsored by Code Crafters. Code Crafters and I teamed up because we have the same style of teaching and learning. Like, my most popular talk ever is called Deconstructing React, where I just taught people how React works by not importing it, but by creating it, like with live coding. And people went, oh, that makes sense. I can do that. They learned by building it. Code Crafters teaches you like how Git works, how Docker works, etc., by having you build it from scratch in a language you know. If you'd like to try that, I'd recommend going to tej.as, that's tej.as/codecrafters, and you'll get 40% off if and when you start paying. They also have a generous free tier, so that's tej.as/codecrafters. There's also links in the show notes. This episode is also sponsored by Stately. So that's stately.ai. Stately is founded and run by my dear friend and future guest on the podcast, David Khurshid, and they make visualizing your app logic exceedingly trivial. Not only that, they generate code from it. You can generate the code for a state machine from a state machine diagram. And it just makes your applications way more predictable, makes you think more about edge cases, and really helps you build more robust applications. So if you want to check that out, stately.ai. Thank you for staying with me so far. I'm excited to go on this journey with you. And now for my discussion with Matt Biilmann. Mathias Biilmann, what an honor to have the co-founder, CEO of Netlify here on the podcast.
Great to be here, and always enjoyable to connect with you.
I'm super honored, and I know there's a number of Netlify users who listen, loyal people, so this is going to be a special one. Before we get started, would you be willing to maybe talk a little bit, do an intro to yourself, and maybe even talk about the foundations of Netlify, and that should probably help us form the basis of a great discussion, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I'm Matt Biilmann, CEO and co-founder of Netlify. Started working on what became Netlify probably back in middle of 2013, at a time where the typical way to build anything for the web was some kind of monolithic application with the user experience and the backend and data access, everything kind of bundled together. And I started really building this belief that longer term, out in the future, the architecture would shift. We would treat the web UI as its own application, essentially, and work on it independently from all the back-end business logic stuff. And we would see all of that sort of turn into APIs and services. And this was like right when, at the time, I think Contentful had raised a seed round in Berlin. There was like the first grains of that going on. There was first couple of headless CMSs starting to make moves and so on. And no one was really thinking about, like, if that world really becomes the world we live in, what are we going to do with the head, so to speak, right? Yeah. So started building out a small MVP, set myself like a 2-week deadline to build a first version, then spend like 2 weeks more to add a billing engine to it and launched a small product called BitBalloon. Then started getting that in front of users and customers, and just started listening and started talking to one of my best friends back from Denmark, who had built his own production company and sold it to a full service agency and was sitting there as chief digital officer, Chris Bach. Convinced him to come join me and turn a real company out of this thing. We launched Netlify in March 2015. So really innovating in focusing just on that web UI layer, tying into the Git-Centric workflow that people had already fully adopted, and then really just getting this zero configuration experience where you would link to a Git repository and you would immediately have a production quality continuous deployment pipeline to a globally distributed network, and get your front end live. Raised our first round of capital a year after in 2016, and coined this term Jamstack to describe this whole shift of architecture, right? Like, and then have really been seeing that architectural play out, right? Like, by now, more than 4.5 million developers have onboarded onto Netlify, and the site stores and apps that are running on our network is reaching more than 1 billion unique visitors every month.
Wow.
And our users now, because we built it this very like bottom up approach with a broad free tier, broad self-serve tier, and then a focus on monetizing large companies in our enterprise plan. Our user spans everyone from people publishing their very first ever website coming right out of a code school to large tech companies like DocuSign or Nirvana or Asana or large consumer goods companies like Unilever or Vodafone, to retailers, to to companies like Peloton, where if you sit down on a Peloton bike, the UI you see is actually coming out of Netlify, right? Like so,
What?
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
um, and and now really seeing like especially that segment of really mature companies fully starting to look how do they take their architecture that's typically been around for a long time and that's typically much more complex than if you're like a growth stage startup building a new product, right? Like how do they
Yeah.
start getting like that architecture modernized and onto sort of a modern composable architecture that fits in with this decoupled approach and where they can build the kind of web experiences there that customers
Yeah.
actually really have come to
Yeah.
expect from them.
Wow, thank you for that. That's such a broad gamut from even pre-Netlify to Netlify to now grown up Netlify, Netlify with a suit and tie, enterprise Netlify, so to speak.
Yeah,
I have so many follow-up questions based on that. And we have a prepared outline discussion here, and I do want to get into some of the features, but based
yeah,
on everything you said, there's so many business-related questions I think that are relevant to the listeners here also that I would love
sure.
to get your perspectives on. But let's start at the beginning, maybe before the beginning. You are a technical founder, and so
Yeah,
you built, you said, the first prototype after asking, hey, we have headless CMSs now, but where's the head going to come from? If I
yeah.
understand correctly, that was the inspiration for, what was it, Bitballoon,
Bit
right?
balloon, yeah.
Okay, and then Bitballoon was the precursor to Netlify. Did you face resistance there? Because you're talking about, oh, wait, this is going to be a thing when it wasn't a thing. The status quo, as you mentioned, was monoliths. Everybody was building monoliths, and you saw a need
Yeah.
possibly before anyone else did. And you go around saying, I'm going to build this UI-driven infrastructure. What was that like? Did you have people tell you this was a bad idea? Don't do it.
Obviously, right? Like anytime you I mean, realistically, every good idea for something brand new in the beginning tends to look like a bad idea, right? Like
Yeah,
because naturally you're catering something that hasn't really happened yet, and you gotta believe that there's a path for something that looks like a bad idea to become a good idea. The other thing we kept running into, like when we were running, this is hard to remember today, and it was a big motivation for doing this. But when we were out racing our first seed round and so on, part of why people thought it was a bad idea was just like, why are you building all this stuff for the web? Right? Like,
yeah,
isn't everything just gonna be mobile apps and then social media, like instant articles and Google building
yeah,
AMP? How are you gonna compete against that? Like, that's gonna just lock people in there and so on, right? Like, so there was also just this sentiment that the web was not like necessarily the future at the time, and we were pretty big believers that this architectural change was part of what was needed to really make the web the
yeah,
best platform we can build for, right? Like, um, and I think we did help make that happen, right? Like, and today no one for sure is questioning that, like, why the web thing anymore, right? Like, it's as vibrant as it's
yeah,
ever been. We can still do a lot better on mobile devices and so on, but the web
yeah.
is definitely here to stay.
Absolutely. Like this comes after an episode that I just recorded with the chair of the TC39 committee, Ujwal Sharma, and
Yeah,
he told me actually the web is so much everywhere that
yeah,
the user interface of the PlayStation 5 runs
yeah,
the web. It runs JavaScript. Absolutely
yeah,
wild.
yeah,
And now
yeah,
you tell me this with Peloton. So that
yeah,
was a good bet. And hindsight is always 2020, but like back then, you faced all this opposition. Where does
yeah,
one, and I'm asking this for the listeners who are probably also somewhat entrepreneurial, where
yeah.
does one find the self-belief and conviction to go like, look, all of you are wrong. I'm going to build this thing. You're telling me it's a bad idea. I don't believe it. I'm going to believe in myself and my idea and do it. And I want to ask this question to you specifically because yes, you use the corporate we, like we believed all these things, but I mean it was you at the time. You didn't even have Chris, right?
At first, there was for sure a period where it was very much, very much just me. I would say, right, like in the very early stages here, um, and I don't know, man. Like some of it is just being unbelievably stubborn. Like, to a certain degree, there's just like a level of stubbornness that's required, I think, for the whole journey because you're gonna hit like all along any of
Mm.
these journeys, and it never ends, right? Like you're gonna get constantly hit by lots of existential threats, lots of big problems, things that are not going your way, like um, huge ups and then huge downs and so on, right? Like, so I think you got to have some certain kind of just innate stubbornness and sort of relentless persistence to say that I will go through pretty unreasonable efforts to
Yeah.
to make it work. And then you somehow have to also really balance it out with figuring out the things that you believe that are wrong, right? Like
Mm.
that's the other piece of it, right? Like you have to learn to, especially to really listen and really observe the users and the customers you put your product in front of,
Yeah.
and trust them in some ways, right? Like
Yeah.
that's a mistake that people can make when they're too much believers, that they kind of think they even know better than users that
Yeah.
are resisting to adopt, right? Like
Yeah.
that's the point you got to look for, right? Like if
Yeah.
you got to find the people that start believing in some way just by using what you build, and you've got to
Yeah.
find out what's valuable to them and build in that
Yeah.
direction. If you do that, you'll probably be okay no matter what everyone else is.
This is so good, yeah. Because I've spoken to a number of entrepreneurs and founders. I literally just got off the phone earlier recording an episode with the founder of Stately, David Khurshid,
Yeah,
and like to be a founder. I'm not one myself, but I've seen this happen a lot, as you described. In the beginning, people tell you it's a bad idea because maybe the idea is so abstract that their mind that fits into the current status quo can't comprehend it. And so the more concrete you make this abstract idea, the more it starts to click. And then this is what you're saying, right? You put it in front of users and then you listen. So you don't listen when the idea is abstract. You start listening when it's more concrete.
yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
that's
That's a
so
good way
useful.
to describe it. Yeah,
Yeah, I think this progressive like becoming concrete of an idea, and then so your receptivity to feedback should scale proportional to how concrete your idea is. That's a brilliant protocol. Thank you for that. I think the listeners will really enjoy that. Indeed, I am.
and
Okay,
and
so
and and listen to the right thing user says, right? Like because if you're a starting founder and you come in front of some developers and you show them a tool and sit them in front of them, like most people are pretty good people at heart, and they'll tell you, oh,
yeah,
this is really nice. Like they'll specifically use words like that. Oh, this is really nice. Oh, this is really interesting.
yeah.
That typically means I like you. You're a nice guy. Nice that you're showing me this, but I don't really care, to be honest, right? Like, and I'll probably not use it, right? Like, so you also gotta
Yeah,
get good at listening to what are people, not just what are people saying, but what are they doing? Okay, did they
yeah,
tell you it was nice and then they started using it? Then there was something there. Did you tell it was really nice, but they didn't start using it?
yeah.
Then you got some real work to do.
Yeah, and I feel like that problem is especially common in the United States for reasons we don't need to go into
True,
now. um,
true.
but
There are areas where you definitely don't run into that problem as much.
and conversely, where in Germany where I live, people will
Yeah,
just tell you they're like, I don't care
yeah,
about this. Sorry.
yeah.
You talked about integrating deeply into the Git
Yeah,
oriented developer workflow.
yeah.
I want to talk about that a little bit and where
Yeah.
that idea came from. I mean, you're a technical founder, so I assume you just were doing a lot of Git based work, and you're like, how cool would it be if my Git push and pull request triggered a deploy preview? Is that the basis of that idea?
Um, so yeah, you could even say, in a way, the startup I built before I even started this, I started a cloud hosted CMS in 2010, in the very start of 2010 in Spain, um, and it was like a multi-tenant cloud hosted CMS with the idea that there would be a very strict separation between like your code and
Hmm.
design and then the actual structured content. Um, and as part of this, I took a lot of inspiration from Git in building like the system for managing the code and the design. So that sim is kind of like back then it had like full versioning. You could like at every time create a new version that was kind of like a branch that used the same sort of consistent hashing and Merkle trees internally to keep all those versions in track and so on. And it was very powerful and gave you this ability to sort of instantly switch back and forth between two different versions of the whole code and design layer, but working against the same content. It even had in 2010 it had basically what was serverless functions in JavaScript, where you could use CommonJS to write like a extension to the template language, and it would run back then on the JVM inside a JavaScript
Wow.
interpreter called Rhino and so on. So a lot of the ideas was there, but it was all monolithic and all coupled together, right? Like, and as I observed the customers working with that, I had FTP access, right? Like, because that was the request I was getting all the time. But I started getting more and more requests for, is there any way we can sync these files and everything with our Git repository? Because that's
And you were
how we're
getting,
starting.
right, sorry to interrupt, and you were getting these requests from clients, from users
From
of this thing.
customers, right? Like,
Wow.
again, listening to customers, looking at
Yeah.
what they were doing, right? Like, and I could really see that not not fully being able to integrate into Git was a problem, and I could see that there wasn't any really great way to fully sync this into Git. In many ways, that became sort of the part of saying, well, if this was all, if I took this like separation between content and design and made it much stronger. And I said, let me just take all of this and make it an actual Git repository and make you build it independently. And then instead of having these like serverless functions you write directly in the code to talk to the content, well, what if you just think of that as an API and so on? So you can see it like was very
Yeah.
natural to have that thinking emerge, right? Like, and I thought, okay, let me start by just separating this front end layer out into its own layer and build Bitballoon as just a like the very first instance was literally just a website would say drag your folder here and it'll be online in seconds, right? Like, so you can drag it
Yeah.
there, added CLI tooling, but the next step there was really figuring out how do I get this plugged into a Git repository. And at first I was looking even at the approach that Heroku had at the time that was kind of like hosting the Git repository itself and syncing, right? Like,
Yeah.
but as I looked at my own workflow and what I was doing, I felt that that's not the real value, right? Like the real value is to hook into where you're working with that Git repository,
Mm.
right? Like, and then I started building out the GitHub integration and so on because I really felt that that's where that's where the core developer workflow is starting to be driven, right? Like people are really starting, like we're really starting to adopt all the metaphors they introduced around pull requests and merges and so on as the main way of doing release management. And I saw, okay, once you have this separation, we can really tie that all the way through. Um, Deploy previews was after we raised the first round of funding. David Calavera joined as our first CTO early on, and he was the one that he was the first one that say, hey, I really believe that we should take this idea of building from Git all the way to every single pull request and just build it. And I was like, brilliant, let's do it. And I think like 2 weeks after he had
What?
it fully running or something like that. It was pretty amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, um, and one of the big innovations we did, I would say that's obviously not like when I say we made that as an innovation, people are often saying, "Oh, but this place you could also deploy pull requests or branches and so on." And it's totally true. Of course, there was lots and lots of different predecessors and so on. But I do really think we made a big distinction in that, like zero configuration flow, where you would just come in, you
Yeah.
would pick your Git repository, and then instantly you had this world-class release management experience where every single pull request just instantly had a URL you could follow along with, and that depended on a lot of the things, right? Like they could only really get to that level by having the UI be stateless and not tied to all your database migrations and stuff like that. And we could make it really efficient by having this underlying like concept of immutable and atomic deploys with very cheap like diffs between them and so on, right? Like
Yeah.
um so it was a lot just this experience of zero friction to get from where you were and to that world.
Wow. This is so cool. I didn't know that around the time that there was already competition for this feature. Because like the first time I ever came across deploy previews was Netlify, and
Yeah.
this was the first time. This was the first time I used it. This was the first time I fell in love with Netlify. This was then I started looking at Netlify and I started using it pretty heavily. And I feel like this is
I
not
would say
unique to me.
we were in the form that you know it, like for sure it was the first, right? Like, but I will say that there were other companies that had CI/CD workflows
Okay.
also building with branches and pull requests and so on that would give you like
Yeah.
some of the same result, but just, you know, clunkier with a lot more manual setup, and often you had to think in migrations and so on. So like deploy previews, as we called it, were definitively like
Yeah.
a thing that I really think at the time was like very different from anything out there. You could
This reminds me of Chat GPT, and I'll tell you why. Because
get.
until ChatGPT came, I consider
Yeah,
ChatGPT. Yes, it's GPT 3.5, and all of this is great. But
yeah,
like
yeah,
before, I think you know where I'm going. Like the model
totally.
was around, but it was
Yeah,
fundamentally the UX and the
precise.
disconnectedness, right? That
Yeah,
made the innovation. It was the
totally,
and you said it this you said it
totally.
the same. The deploy preview feature is the whole seamless end to end user experience that made the difference.
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
I'm still wondering about the internals here. So when I found out, I want to get your technical
Yeah.
expertise here. Wow, what a I need to pause and recognize what a privilege it is to have you on this podcast and be able to explain this to me, because there's so many developers who are going like, how does that work? Um,
Yeah,
can we talk about that a little bit? The deploy
yeah, yeah,
previews
sure.
from an engineering perspective. So
Yeah,
when I was first exposed to this, it would have been 2000. I don't know, 2014, 15, something
yeah.
around there. I don't know when the feature came out,
2015
but
probably. I think 2015 we had the full like all the CI/CD from the main branch. In 2016 we launched deploy previews as like pull requests, actually, like
okay.
all getting their unique URL.
So it must have been 2016 there. And I
Yeah,
was working with a front end engineer who is one of the most competent front end engineers I know. And
yeah,
he said, hey, check this out. Netlify has
yeah,
this thing where they will like deploy your. And so I go use it and I'm wowed, right? Like I think anybody would be. And I asked him, how does this work on the inside? And his answer was this, and I quote, he said, it's just Kubernetes. And I was like, what does that even mean?
yeah.
So obviously since then we've grown and we've learned and we've talked, and so now I have a theory of how I could build this myself, and I'm curious to know how far this is from reality. So you in real time here you get to tell me how wrong I am, but I would consider it's Git integrated, so you're listening to webhooks from push events or pull request events, and from there you kick off some type of build process to generate static assets. And this is actually the Netlify command, like type the command npm
Mhm.
run build. And so you run that command in a container on your infrastructure, and then you get the final built assets and you shove them in a CDN. And
Mhm.
I guess the part that I'm not clear about is how did they get exposed over HTTP and get the URL allocation and things like that.
I think a lot of the magic, like that's actually where we build a lot of the magic, right? Like um, so funny enough, back when your friend said that, at that point we weren't actually using Kubernetes at all. now
That's what
now
I
now we
expected.
do have like now all the builds runs in large Kubernetes clusters. Back then, it was all a scheduler I wrote myself. So,
Wow.
but um, but I think a lot of the magic comes in separating that deployment layer in like I think that was actually one of the big difference that at the time CDNs were starting to become more popular, but they were something you put in front of something else, right? Like and you would
Yeah.
pass through and then you would try to set cache rules there. Some CDNs gave you a lot of flexibility, like Fastly, you can write all your VCLs in like a dialect of C and you get a lot of control, but you have to do it.
Wait, so sorry to interrupt you.
Cloudflare,
What's a VCL for those listening?
it's just like the technical. It's actually its own kind of programming language for programming cache rules in Varnish, right? Like pretty technical. Cloudflare gives you some simpler page rules, but you still have to go in and define all
Yeah.
of that. And in Engine, they just sit as a layer in front, like close to the user, but in front of some origin, right? Like, and I think that was the big innovation originally that we said, like, we don't want that to be like something that sits in front. We want it to be where you actually deploy to. Um, And
Hmm.
as part of that, as I said, like already before this, I built this independent layer for managing all of your design files at Webpack, my previous startup, right? Like, so part of what made the deploy previews really simple to implement was that our deployments were actually like, if you know how Git manages its content internally, it uses this concept of a Merkle tree, right? Like that means that every object in Git, you take the content of that object, you create a content, like you create a cryptographic hash of that, and that becomes the address of how to look up that object in storage. Then
By
you
by object, you mean a file that could be
a
committed in a
file,
repo.
any file,
Okay.
right? Like any file in Git, you'll create a cryptographic signature of that file, and then you'll have a tree document that says this path should resolve to this crypto, like to this SHA, right? Like
Hmm.
you have like
This
tree
hash, right?
objects and you have like the actual objects, right? Like, and that's what gave Git back at its day all the magic of instantly being able to like check out a new branch, do stuff, commit it, and then switch back to the other branch. And I remember when I first saw that, it was like kind of the same magic as the deploy previews, right? It was kind of like, how in my file system can I have one thing one moment and then one thing another moment, right? Like, and
Yeah.
these Merkle trees are kind of the secret behind that. So we build all of our deployment layer sort of as a giant Merkle tree, where everything you upload essentially gets a cryptographic signature, and then we keep track of some tree objects that will say like, when you hit this URL, these
Yeah.
paths result to these objects, right? It means if you make a change to a site and deploy something new, we don't have to re-upload everything. We just upload the new object and we change the tree object, so to speak, right? Like that gave us from
Yeah.
the beginning this idea of atomic immutable deploys, where from the very first time, like every deploy you ever had would have a unique URL. You could go visit, you could see how your site looked like at that time, and you could roll back and so on, right? Like, so the deploy previews, of course, like you trigger a build from somewhere. We run today a Kubernetes container, back then a VM, right? Like, run your build, do a deployment that again just
Right.
detects like what files actually change, uploads the new files and updates, creates a new tree object essentially for that deployment, and then on the edge, we build our own CDN for this reason, right? Like, on the edge, when a request comes in, we know how to do the lookup and figure out from the routing, like which object should I actually serve for this specific path, for this specific URL right now. And we can look that up and serve it. And when you do a new deploy, once all the files are ready, we'll send an atomic command to all the CDN nodes. They will update their pointer to the tree essentially, right?
Hmm.
Like, and now instantly you have this instant cache purge where you have an atomic deploy and every node now knows
Yeah.
what to serve for your site, right? Like, so there's a lot of engineering in that piece of it, right? Like that makes
Yeah.
this viable.
And the cool thing is it's all just inspired by Git. Wow, I had no idea the
It's
Git
all
based
inspired by
workflow was all inspired by Git. Well, thank you for that deep dive and the education around Merkle trees as well. I'm
yeah,
sure
yeah.
the listeners
Careful with
absolutely
getting me
enjoy that.
started.
No, no, that's literally the point of this podcast. So please, if you have more, continue. This works great, and now thank you. I fully understand that, especially expanding on what my friend said was it's just Kubernetes. You do run a Kubernetes container that does these things and then pushes to the CDN and then updates the
Yeah,
references to the
yeah.
trees. That can I see how that works for static content, and indeed Netlify earlier specialized exclusively in
Yeah,
static content, as far as I
yeah,
know. But how does that scale then to functions? I know that's a feature
yeah.
of Netlify as well.
I mean, that was another big innovation of ours, right? Like, because we started out in 2015 with just static content, right? Like, and then I guess 2017 was when we built our serverless functions feature. And again, similar sort of thing. I was seeing what was happening in the space around like the serverless framework and so on, like after AWS Lambda came out. But most of the usage of like Lambda had such an obvious like promise, right? Like you just put
Yeah.
your code in a file and upload it, and now you can evoke dynamic code in the cloud without having to worry about any kind of like infrastructure, right? Like
Yeah.
very in line of what we were doing otherwise. But all the workflow questions around it made it really complex, right? Like
Yeah.
you had to, for every Lambda, you had to figure out setting up an API gateway point and then build a release management. And then like, how are you actually going to route to those Lambdas from your app and so on, right?
Exactly.
Like, so one weekend I built this POC of like, what if you could just put files in a folder in your front end repository, and when you deployed behind the scenes, those got deployed to Lambdas, and now you can like and now since we already do all this routing on the edge, we already do this resolution of hey, a request
Right.
comes in, what cryptographic hash do we have that we should
Yeah.
serve? We can introduce saying like instead of just that, we know we should invoke a Lambda function, right? Like, and this is the
I
function
see.
we should invoke. And now the CDN nodes can start directly invoking Lambda functions. We don't need an API gateway and everything because we kind of build it there, right? Like, and then we productionized that
Yeah.
and integrated it into the same kind of tree, right? Like, so you get every Lambda again is immutable, and we got this whole um you've got this whole capability that also really felt pretty magical, right? Like that for the backend code running in Lambdas, you got the same kind of deploy previews and the same kind of like immutable atomic deploys where you can instantly switch back and forth between two. We started introducing things like our A/B testing feature where you could say like start splitting the traffic to my site between branch A and branch B,
Yeah.
right? Like and it all just worked together.
Incredible. I had no idea that you built, not you, but I guess Netlify built a custom, your own CDN, because
Yeah.
I thought it was definitely just piggybacking off of S3 or,
No,
something
no,
like
no.
that.
That was I mean that if you ask about when people thought this is a stupid idea, that was definitively when I was one technical person in the company bootstrapping, and I started building my own CDNs. I actually like built that first core bit back in 2014 or so.
Wow. But what does that mean? I mean, like, so if you ask me to go build a CDN today, I will like use Upstash or Cloudflare or something like this. So what, you put like physical servers in various places around the world and
We
connected them?
so that was the real like so that was what all CDNs used to do. They used to invest in physical hardware and ship them to data centers around the world. What I saw early on was like, hey, if you just look at the different public cloud providers, they're building data centers all over the world, and you can programmatically design like where you want your VMs to run in those data centers, right? Like now it suddenly becomes possible for me as just at the time as just a single person, right? Like to say, hey,
Yeah.
I could just put servers in all of those data centers, and then I can build a DNS based router that when a request comes in, make sure that you get sent to the closest server to you that is marked as available, right? Like, so I built a little DNS controller that would constantly monitor the network. And as soon as one region became unavailable, we would start routing around it to another region and so on, right? Like, um, and
Wow.
that became the start of our CDN that today, like we have a large team managing this, right? Like, but it was really important for us that we could write the software ourselves that
Yeah.
ran on these edge nodes. And even in a lot of the launches we've done recently, um, where we've actually like really done some really cool stuff around how edge caching work, and especially how you can cache dynamic content and so on. A lot of that also still really relies on us owning the software that runs in those in those points of presence all over the world.
Wow, that is so cool. Okay, so it's actually a software only CDN. It's
Yeah,
it's a it's essentially
yeah.
an algorithm that can, wow. That is so cool. Now that Netlify has evolved and so on,
Yeah.
is some early stage of that open source? And is there a plan to do so?
Um, no, that's never been that part has never been open source, and frankly, it would be hard. Like it's the kind of nitty gritty infrastructure management and operational code and so on that's definitely not very prone to be a viable open source project, and that requires a lot of like that today requires a lot of team. Like it's also the software today that implements all of our custom like DDoS mitigation, TLS termination, rate limiting,
Right.
filtering, all of that. So it's pretty key software for us.
Right. Yeah, and definitely. So I was talking more about like the first ever commit,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
you can
yeah.
use for
True,
teaching.
true. I should go back and
But
see how, how I did it there.
uh,
It was
what I
pretty
heard
simple back
was,
then. Like it was basically like using using Ansible to automate all of the provisioning of any new CDN server, using Terraform to define how the servers should, like how the infrastructure should be provisioned,
mm,
um, and then um, very very first version it was Dyn DNS that later got sold. Later we migrated to another DNS provider. A bunch of logic around their API to manage DNS zones and global routing and so on.
right.
Yeah, it would be fun to go take a look at.
It it sounds like a lot of the success of Netlify today comes from doing a really good job of separating concerns. Because you
Yeah.
mentioned you had this layer, this layer, this layer, then you
Yes.
composed it, and then you got Netlify. I think there's a lesson there, a takeaway for listeners, like just SOC or separation of concerns is so important to get right, and it may not be what you think it is, right? Because like in the case of React, everybody thought this is bad. You're rethinking best practices. You're breaking SOC, but turns out React fixed the separations of concerns by turning
Yeah.
UI just into a function of state.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned. I want to ask maybe a. I want to get into some of the newer Netlify features in just a minute, but I do have one, maybe one more question before that, which is you mentioned you went away in a weekend and you wrote this POC, and your technical founder. I want to hear from you as the founder now of a very successful, I consider Netlify a pretty successful company. Should the CEO and founder code? How much time do you get? Do you still do that today? Like, what does that look like?
I still maybe to the worry of the team come back from weekends with new POCs for sure.
Wow.
Like, I think it's like just 2 demo days ago I came back with a new POC to the team. So definitely still happens. And I don't think I think any answer to those kind of like what should a founder do in this case or that case is like honestly there's no rule, right? Like
Yeah.
you've got to do what's right for you. I know
Yeah.
really great founders that have never touched a line of code in their whole life, and are building amazing businesses and a really like great dynamic storytellers and company leaders. I know, like I heard that Toby was writing some of the initial code for hydrogen at Shopify, even at their stage, right? Like, so I
Yeah.
know even at that stage, there are the occasional rare founder that still just gets their hand dirty with code. And I
Yeah.
and I just think that there's no simple answer to that other than is it a way that you can add value to the business? Like at any given time, I just try to ask myself, like, what are the biggest thing the business needs to solve for right now, and
Mm.
what is the most important thing I can do to help the business solve those problems or take those
Yeah.
opportunities, right? Like, and it's very rare, to be honest, that involves me writing code, but there are a couple of times where yeah, it like where I feel like I'm still at an intersection of understanding business and opportunity and our systems where I can make a POC that maybe for someone else it wouldn't
Yeah.
occur to them, right? Like,
Yeah.
so when I can do that, I'll jump in and do it.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
would say if I was sitting and spending my day-to-day writing production code for our system, then I probably shouldn't be CEO anymore. I should be a developer, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really great answer. And I like that you said that there's no rule, and it depends. And I do think like the whole company started with you feeling some type of need in the market and then filling that need. And so like this intuition is crucial. And as we talked about, right, an idea may be so abstract that people don't see the point. So POC is
yeah,
necessary.
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely appreciate that. Okay, let's get to the thing we originally decided to talk about,
yeah,
which is Netlify got in trouble, I believe, recently. I try to minimize my time on social media, believe it or not. But there was this case where a user, got this huge surprise bill, and it turns out they were being DDoSed, and of course they got a refund, and that was resolved as far as I can see. But then you posted this really long piece of text explaining how Netlify handles spikes in traffic and
Mhm.
distinguishes between malicious and legitimate traffic. And I think something you highlighted so eloquently, I just want to call that out, is you want to like be able to support the user having a huge successful Black Friday moment, but at
yeah,
the same time you have to balance that with like, wait, is this malicious? And that sounds like an extremely complex, nuanced topic, and that's why this podcast exists: technical
yeah,
deep dives and
yeah.
nuance. So, like, can you speak to all of that? Maybe from the time you got the report to the response and everything in between.
Yeah, I was sitting, I think it was midnight in San Francisco, and I was wrapping up work on a presentation for an event the day after, and then someone pinged me about a tweet on this and a Hacker News post, and I went in and saw it. I was like, what the hell is going on here? So jumped in, pinged the support person on like pinged in our internal support channel and said like, hey, can someone reach out to this person and tell them that they're not going to pay anything for this, right? Like, obviously, um, we did that, but I could also see that, okay, um, probably needed to jump in and address the community, wrote in and tried to write a couple of concise comments on the Hacker News thread. Got some sleep and woke up in the morning and prepared more of a response. And obviously, like, it was a really like it was absolutely something that should never happen to someone, right? Like, some free user suddenly, like, so the flow of events, some free user that's been with us for a long time has uploaded an MP3 file to our system, link from their website. I think like a Vietnamese singer or something like that, like from that
Mm-hmm.
region. Um, and
And you call out the region here because it's there's a CDN involved, and there's requests
we
going to that
I also
specific.
pointed out, because like when you want to, like, when we want to, from a systems level, say what kind of traffic should our system
Yeah.
always block and what kind
Yeah.
of traffic might we not block, right? Like, so this was an MP3 file in that region. Suddenly it started getting a lot of downloads, right?
Mm.
Like, driving up terabytes and terabytes of traffic over several days, and our system would start sending out large large like overages amount every single day to the user.
Yeah.
um and in the end they got in touch, and by that point, over several days, they had racked up like technically a bill of 104,000. um
Wow.
and and first thing first, like, we don't, this was a free user, so there was no credit card attached, and we don't even have a billing address of the user. Obviously, like, there's no way we would ever have tried to collect any of this,
Money.
like, this money. But
Yeah.
we should have let them know that immediately, right? Like, and we've definitely upgraded, like, we've definitely clarified our internal support processes after that, on like, how should you distinguish between what happens on a free plan and on a business plan where people are interested in their traffic. But the other question is, like, why does our system not stop that traffic? And look, we are now building spend limits to put in place so people can opt in to just have our system kill the traffic if they don't care. But the original thought of designing the system like that was always this, like the last thing I wanted to happen was like a new startup launching something on Netlify. They actually hit their moment, right? Like, and any founder out there that's tried it knows how hard that is, right? Like you hit that moment where suddenly the internet picks up on you and notice that you exist and starts sending crazy amounts of traffic. And then Netlify takes you down because you're over your allotment, right? Like that's the thing that was on top of mind when we built this system, that we don't want that to happen, right? Like we want to make sure that we keep you up. And as I said in the post, right, like we can, if we kill that traffic, we can never give that viral moment back to you.
Yeah.
But if we rack up some more riches, we can always refund those to you, right? Like that's like one of the things we can reverse, the other thing we can reverse, right? Like, so that's like how we designed the system. Now we still have a lot of built-in, like a lot of people commenting like, why don't Netlify have DDoS mitigation? And we definitely have state-of-the-art DDoS mitigation. There's a lot of different things when you talk of DDoS. There's everything called like lower than level 7, which is like all the UDP reflection attacks, or like pure, like where you amass like tons of hacked devices that start sending broken TCP packages and so on, right? Like all of that is handled essentially by us at the cloud provider level, and those attacks just never reach our actual nodes. Then there's what you call level 7 attacks, which is when you have traffic that is legitimate, like HTTP requests that respects the TLS handshake and seemingly come from an actual device, right? Like that are attack patterns, right? Like, and that's the area where like we have a lot of different types of rate limiting and attack detection, but we always have to balance between like protecting against attacks and making sure that legitimate sudden spikes in traffic don't get blocked.
Yeah.
So in this case, we still haven't like 100% internally determined, and we like for obvious reason, like there's not a lot we can do to determine it if this was an attack or if it wasn't. It was most likely and some kind of attack. But think about think about the legitimate case where it wasn't an attack. You have like someone launching like a hit song in a region where a lot of people use Tor exit nodes or VPNs or all of that. Like in these regions like Vietnam and stuff like that, people will often go through some intermediary servers instead of just being on the net. They'll often be very driven by things like massive WhatsApp groups or something as their social networks and so on. And it could be that someone just mentioned like this cited this link in a group, and a bunch of people went through like VPNs and Tor exit nodes on GCP that started downloading this hit song. Or it could be that it was an attack for some reason. I don't know who would have a reason to attack, but maybe someone were just testing their technology or whatever. And it took the created that level of traffic, right? Like, but from our system, if we block one kind, we do block both kinds if we decide to make it automatically. And that's the kind of things we constantly have like network engineers reviewing and deciding like what's safe to block and what's not safe to block, to make sure we protect against attacks. And that's also what our team will try to review if there is a large bill on a paying account. Like as I said, on free accounts, if you get a large bill and we think it's legitimate traffic, we might ask you, like, we might tell you, like, look, if you want to keep serving this kind of traffic, you're going to start paying us. But it is totally free accounts. Like, we don't have any billing methods on file and so on. So in the case where people say us, no, I'll rather stop my service, well, we would probably just stop the service, right? Like, but if it's a legitimate paying business account that have an interest in keeping their traffic up, we'll try to like we'll review and try to determine, was this actually an attack? And then if it was, it's on us. If it wasn't, we'll find a way to
Yeah.
get to a reasonable pricing for that.
Yeah, I really appreciate this detailed answer, and I'm sure the listeners would as well, and even the person who got the huge bill. I mean, if you hear that and you don't have anything other than appreciation, something's wrong. I especially like that you
I want
talk
to
about.
say I'm really sorry for that person. I can understand that they would get really frightened getting that kind of like invoice in their inbox, and it should never have happened.
Yeah.
And we put also just like manual review processes in place to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Good. I'm happy to hear that sounds like the last time that'll happen. I love that you especially wanted to highlight the importance of protecting you, as you said it so beautifully, that moment. Like when a founder hits that moment, because this happened to me actually. I'm not a founder, but one of my side projects went very viral, and I hit that moment, and it crashed. And literally, like I had composable architecture, right? I had multiple layers, and each layer was like, nope, I'm not serving any more traffic. No, and it was I had to explain to people. But so I appreciate that. This is sorry. Go ahead. Did you want to add something?
No, just that's exactly. I mean, I don't know. There was even a part of the motivation for the idea around like the more you can build statically and so on, because I had so often seen that happen, right? Like posts on way back in the day, it was Slashdot, and you had this whole name for the Slashdot effect of like something got popular and it went down, right? Like, and then Hacker News, Reddit, and so on, right? Like, it's the worst thing if something finally gets popular and then it goes down, right? Like, it's such a bittersweet moment, right? Like,
You mentioned this is a free user multiple times. You've mentioned multiple times that the free tier on Netlify does not require a credit card. It like free isn't like absolutely free. There is no catch. So I've been doing some developer relations consulting for various startups, and this is a conversation we keep having. One, should we have a free tier or a free trial or none? And two. And two, the second question is, should we go for a bottom-up or top-down strategy? Meaning, do we cater primarily to everyday developers, or do we start with large enterprise? Now, Netlify, you mentioned, started with a bottom-up approach and a free tier. How has that affected the business? Was it a struggle to turn revenue at some point? What was that like?
I mean, every way you do it will have some struggle in it, right? Like, and we're definitely no perfect example, right? Like, but of course, a lot of our initial revenue motion was really built on a very organic bottom-up motion, right? Like people coming in, self-architecting, starting to mature, and then starting to ask us for like, we're going live, what's the SLA and so on, right? Like, and we built like also, you obviously got to have like, again, listen to the customers, see what's important to different types of customers, and then build that out, right? Like, so we have our self-serve tier network where all of the free customers and all of the normal self-serve customers are running. And we do a lot of work to detect fraud, and some like, there's another thing that's hard about running a free tier, right? Like you got to build a lot of fraud detection, and you sometimes also really end up disappointing. Like we've definitely had cases that I always feel bad where I see them, where someone puts something up and it gets banned automatically by our system and so on, right? Like, but we got to do a lot of that work to keep like the reputation of our self-serve network good, and to keep it safe from attacks and so on, right? Like, but we then also operate a completely separated enterprise network only for customers that are on SLA and with production traffic, right? Like that will never be mixed with those kind of users, and where we can really focus on like every request should be delivered, where we can, again, our rate limiting on our self-serve tier will be more aggressive in terms of like keep the tier safe, and keep users from being hit with too much traffic they don't want. Whereas on the enterprise layer, typically it will be more tweaked towards like, we got to keep our customer sites operating no matter what, right? So you start building those selling motions and that organic flow. Then you also learn over time that, especially where we sit in the system, if you talk to like really large companies, typically a developer in that company will never have like any permission to put part of that company's domain on a service like Netlify without
Yeah.
like, and for good reasons, right? Like because they have a lot of developers and a lot of different properties and so on. And you can't just have have madness, right? Like every one of these services needs a really thorough security review. There needs to be an actual like legal contract in
Yeah.
place between us and the company using us and so on, right? Like so there you start seeing that bottom up motion being less of a motion. You have to start building an actual like mature enterprise selling motion to go directly to those companies and help them adopt, right? Like
Yeah.
that's like always a hard transition point for every company, right? Like
Yeah.
um and and we're in that point of like working with larger and larger customers, and like really exciting to see like those kind of like amazing big company projects live on our network. But it's a very different selling process and so on. We've definitively sometimes seen the tension between operating both models, and it's never totally easy, and we've sometimes done good at it and sometimes done bad at it, but I'm trying to get us better at it in general.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, so what I'm hearing is you started entirely, this is free for every developer, bottom up, and organically over time, the financial aspect sort of fell into place. It sounds like because you said these
We
people.
actually, so I would say we actually started in the very early days. The free tier was actually much more limited, because
Mm,
we're more for like in the first year we were bootstrap business, right? Like so there, any if you wanted to get a custom domain at all, you had to pay, right?
yeah,
Like then when we, especially when we raised the Series A, we decided, okay, now we can focus more on the bigger business model, and we can actually make more of our free tier real free, and use that to drive awareness and upsells into our self-serve tier, and then longer term upsells into our real enterprise solution, right? Like, and that's still where we at, right? Like like
yeah,
by now the free tier on Netlify has more features and higher limits and more capabilities than it's ever had, right? Like,
yeah.
and it's important to us. Um,
Yeah,
so
but I find it especially intriguing that there's this curve of adoption at some point where you mentioned the free tier users were like, okay, so we're going into production. What is the SLAs? And
yeah,
it sounds like they prompted you to then come up with, oh, we need to make money. Okay, okay, okay. Let's put together this thing. And so what I'm hearing is today the process is ongoing, where you're now engaging with very very large clients, but it's still something that is in the process of being figured out, which is so cool. I mean, from a DevRel perspective, this is a dream, right? Because most companies are like, let's just build a really great product, give it away for free, and see if anyone wants to pay us for it. That's basically what you did. Um, if you could wave a magic wand and do it differently, would you? Or like, would you start thinking about paid stuff ahead of time, or would it be exactly the same?
it would be the same, and as I said, like even early on, we had paid tiers and so on. So we've always thought about this holistically, right? Like we always thought, even when Chris and I started talking really early on, we always said this thing to each other: if we had this magic button we could press, where individual developers or open source developers using our system would never pay anything, but companies and commercial organizations using our system would always pay for it, we would definitely press that button, right? Like
Mm,
that because that's kind of the philosophy, right? Like we're not really our business is not monetizing individual developers, it's selling
yeah,
B2B software, right? Like we want every developer to have Netlify in their tool belt and to know how to use it and to know that it's a great product, right? Like
yeah,
and to understand that they can build really cool things with this and that will scale for them and work for them and so on. But we want their companies then to buy Netlify's product and to become customers, right? Like
yeah,
so right from the beginning, we always thought about it in that way, right? Like if we could magically snap a
yeah,
finger and make that happen, we would do it. Now that's incredibly hard to do, right? And we've iterated a lot on our pricing, and we've gotten something right, and we've gotten some things really wrong along the way, and then fixing them and so on, right? Like so, in hindsight, if I went back, I would just do all the things we got right and none of the things that we got wrong,
Wow.
and then do more things right, right? Like, but it's fully iterative
Yeah.
in that way, right? But I
Yeah.
think the fundamental principle, I still think it's the right one, right? Like,
Yeah.
how can you give developers access to learn and understand the full value proposition of your product? How can you show them that this is really great technology and that this can do great things for them? And
Yeah.
then how can those developers be your greatest evangelist when you're selling into the businesses they work for?
Mhm. Yeah, and then making developer advocates out of just every developer that loves your free tier, right?
Yeah,
So it's not DevRel is not a function of your company; it's a function of the whole
yeah.
world because your product is so
Ideally,
great.
you want, like, I mean, ideally when you can, even as a person, right? Like, it's a lot nicer when someone else points to you and say, "Hey,
Yeah.
Tejas is like awesome," than if you go
Thanks.
around and say, I'm awesome," right? Like, people get
Yeah.
pretty tired of hearing that pretty fast, right? Like,
Yeah.
but if all people around you are saying that, it resonates a
Yeah.
lot, right? Like, so generally, you want
Yeah.
advocates to be the community actually thinking that what you're doing
Yeah.
is really worth right and really good.
Indeed,
Um,
and this is also why you don't like it. It also hits different when like paid people say you're awesome. Like if I
yeah,
pay Theo to make a
also
YouTube video saying I'm awesome, this is not going to mean much.
it,
Yeah.
it's true. It's true. Like, the genuine, like, when you can genuinely get people to stand
Yeah.
up and say this is pretty cool, that is very reliable evidence that there's something cool here.
Yeah, and it's reliable evidence that you found product market fit (PMF). I'm well aware that now that you're playing in the enterprise space and you have some big clients, that there's a lot of NDAs and things. But I would be remiss if I didn't ask, what is the biggest thing on Netlify right now? The biggest property on the web via Netlify? Is it Peloton, or is there
um,
something bigger?
no, I think, like, the biggest one I can talk about is probably have been some of the launches Riot Games have been doing, where they've been pushing out, like, in-game marketing campaigns for League of Legends and so on, and League of Legends get a lot of traffic, right? Like,
I can imagine.
so we've handled some pretty incredible spikes there. We're talking like petabytes of data a month from, like, a single,
Wow.
like, that we've seen going out of our network at some points, right? Like,
Wow.
uh,
What was the first very large enterprise customer for Netlify, and how did it feel? I mean, this has to feel like that moment that you hit, but in a different level because it's not mass market. It's
it's
100. It's a big portion of the market that you want to hit, right?
yeah. I mean, very different stages, right? Like, the fun one when we were literally just two people bootstrapping was WeWork.com running on Netlify back then, which was like, okay, this feels a little bigger than we were technically even, like, should be doing, but it was cool. Um, Later on, I think one of the early adopters in really big traditional enterprise space was Unilever, right? Like,
Wow.
where today even Unilever.com is on Netlify, right? Like, a
Wow.
big complex customer, that we've learned a lot from, also supporting, right? So
Yeah.
so yeah, those are a couple of the ones where I think there's already been public mentions out there, so I can
Fantastic. Yeah, I
have
wonder if
some.
you all do the thing at conferences. I haven't seen this from Netlify at conferences, but if you have a booth, like to have a big
Mm,
wall of logos. I know
yeah,
some companies that do that, and it always impresses me. So,
yeah,
um,
yeah. We have a good wall of logo slide in our thing, the decks we show people for sure.
that's awesome. Okay, let's talk about some new Netlify stuff that's coming. I'm very excited about these, particularly one thing. So
Yeah,
my
yeah,
biggest pain point on Netlify, when I've used it in any reasonable depth, actually there were two of them. The first one was the local development experience. So
yeah,
Netlify Dev, great, but this was a pain point before Netlify Dev was what it is today. So that
yeah.
was like almost, and I say this respectfully, but that was like trauma that really put me off Netlify for a long time. It's improved a lot now, but now
Good to know.
another pain point that I've had consistently, I would say, over the years with Netlify is this use of or this requirement for adapters. for
Mm.
frameworks like Next.js, frameworks like Remix, Astro. It's difficult, and I'm somewhat nervous to say this to you. I mean, this is your baby, but it's difficult. So I know that there's some new implementations to these adapters. I'm wondering if we can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely right. Like I think that was one area where back in July I made some changes to the structure to the company and stepped much closer to the product myself again. And as I sort of really just dived in deep to see like where did we have room to improve and so on. I think that was one of the areas where I said like, hey, here I feel like we're not doing as well as we should. I think we had been spending a lot of time on a Next runtime, but there was a lot of custom code in that to make Next work on Netlify, and it wasn't great for the new app router features that were emerging. It didn't do a great job with ISR on demand and so on, right? Like, and there was a bit of a silo between the team building that and the team building our actual platform level features that made it hard to really get parity. And because that one got riddled, it took a lot of the frameworks team's focus away from doing great with the frameworks that should actually be much easier to support on Netlify. So we did some big changes there. The first one was really say holistically, okay, what are the key platform features we should build that will really help us in this space? And I think one of the things that just shifted a lot is that like from the beginning, when we built our network, as I said, we always like we were the first ones to launch like serverless functions and so on. We also pioneered like edge functions and so on.
Yeah.
But the caching characteristics of our systems made it extremely simple to cache static content, but didn't give you a lot of control when you were working with dynamic content. And part of what made some of the adapters hard to really get to the point we wanted them to be was that a lot of the ecosystem has switched more towards like dynamic rendering plus different kind of cache constructs, right?
Yeah.
Like, so we really sort of sat down and said, okay, what would it take to get us best in class clearly for caching dynamic content? And then had like a full series of launches around that, including cache tags with custom cache purges, right? Like where you can now tag any, like in your cache headers, you can add cache tags and then you can instantly purge by those tags independently of deployments and so on. We introduced pretty like, again, a really innovative feature that we call Netlify Vary
Mm-hmm.
that essentially allows you to define when you send a response, how should the cache key for this response be made? And that matters a lot when you're caching dynamic content because like dynamic content might depend on query parameters, or it might
Yeah.
depend on a value of a cookie, or it might depend on the country or like the accept header or things like that, or it might not, right? Like if by
Yeah.
default our systems takes all of those into account for every object, well, then you're almost like then there's almost no chance that two different users will get the same cache key and
Yeah.
you end up with like nothing getting cached. But if our system assumes that none of those are in play, right? Like then we cache the wrong thing and then you can't
Yeah.
really cache. So this gives like the dynamic origin a way to say like this URL, I care about the page and per page query parameter, and that's all. And now we can generate the cache key from a URL based on that and get really efficient. We also announced like blob storage for storing objects outside of the files that are stored statically from a deploy, right? Like gives you just like a
Oh,
basically an
it's like
S3 bucket, but where you never have to
yeah.
worry about like tokens or access controls and so on. You can just call it from builds, from functions, from edge functions, and build around it. We launched our image CDN feature that gives you like easy way to like resize, crop images on the fly on the CDN. And then on top of all of that, we tightly linked our frameworks team and our platform team to then use those to go make all the list of modern frameworks really great to work on Netlify. we just rolled out a completely, internally we called it the minimal Next runtime. That's a much simplified way of getting Next running on Netlify, that now gives full support for the app folder, for on-demand ISR, for all of these caching patterns and so on. If you're using Next today and you set it up, there'll be a button to just opt in, and pretty soon it'll just be the default. If you're deploying a Next project to Netlify, it'll just happen. And in general, none of these adapters are really something that the individual developers should have to worry about, right? Like, we're really just getting to that point where you deploy a framework to Netlify and it should just work. But we're thinking a lot about how can we make all of these primitives really simple to work on Netlify, right? Like, we had a guide up on how easy it is to set up ISR for remix on Netlify now, right? Like, essentially just leaning on the stale while revalidate header, and boom, you're done, right? Like, have an article coming out of how to do ISR with Astro on Netlify, and the approach we have is really thinking that we're really getting back to is our original approach of thinking, what are the right great platform primitives that allow any framework to do the right thing, so we can have very simple, easy to understand framework adapters that make them use those features, but so the platform is really geared to where the modern ecosystem is at.
Yeah. That's really exciting. And personally for me, that touches on exactly what I had real difficulty with. And I'm not even like making this up. Like, you and I did talk about this before the episode, but like, this is an actual pain point that I can't wait to. I just want to build a Next.js 14 site now and deploy to Netlify to see how it feels. Because even back then,
it should feel awesome. And if that, let me know. We'll make it awesome.
Because even then, I was already a little bit upset when I tried the first time that I had to like npm install Next on Netlify, and for the life of me, I was thinking, I was like, you control my build environment, just install it there. So if I understand correctly, that's not required anymore.
No, that'll all happen automatically. You should just be able to run, like, connect to a Git repo, it'll all be picked up automatically.
Excellent.
We'll even see in the UI that we detect that it's Next and that we give you the right runtime that works out of the box. And so.
Excellent. Turnkey. You know, this is AI. Right? This is like, I mean, there's predefined rules, sure, but it's still AI to me, like, because you can detect my thing. That's excellent. You talked about setting the derivatives of a cache key manually by use. I think that's really cool and really novel. How do you do that as a user? Is it just exposed by the Netlify UI and per site settings? You just like
no, I think that's the difference. You just do it in the response. So you just set a header in the response where you just say Netlify vary query equals page plus per page, for example, and then it does it. Because all the other systems, like, that's where the innovation is, I think, right? Like, if you are using any other CDN like CloudFront or Cloudflare or Fastly, you can control cache keys, but you gotta do it in the CDN up front, right? Like, so you have to go into your CloudFront distribution and define for these URL patterns, use this. Or you can go into Cloudflare and you can set page rules and say, for these, like, for any URL that starts with this, take the cookie into account.
Right.
In Fastly, you do it again with that VCL language they have, right? Like,
the value here is right. Let me say sorry to interrupt. Let me say the innovation here, so you can correct me if I'm wrong and make sure I really get it. The innovation here is you're able to do this not at like static configuration time of the CDN, but dynamically per request and response.
Precisely.
Wow.
No one else does that. So.
Netlify keeps innovating. This is so great, and no wonder you're seeing the success you see. Can I share with you one feature request I've had for Netlify for a long time?
Always.
I don't think this is possible on the free tier, but I'm super happy to be wrong. And it's okay. I'm happy to pay for it for production workloads. I just want to be clear. I'm not a free tier moocher. But anyway, I think it's the support for long-running functions or jobs. So to say, every morning I pull all my posts on X from yesterday, and I want this to happen on schedule. Now I know that there's scheduled jobs, but depending on how much I post, this could take like 30 seconds, 1 minute, 3 minutes, and
Yeah.
I'm happy to pay for that, like I don't know, per minute or something. But I find this to be a hole in almost every serverless provider.
We have it on our pro tier. We call it the background functions.
Okay,
Um,
but even those cap out at 15 minutes. No.
so it is true. We do have the limit of a 15 minutes per execution right now. Um, what like I want to know some more of
Sure.
it, right? Like because we have explored different primitives there, and it's definitely something I'm thinking about. Like we have one primitive we're experimenting with, which is more of a long running dev server in the cloud, um, similar to if you take what Gatsby Cloud had built around like their preview feature. That was kind of like a
Hmm.
long running server that you used for previews. It was very
Yeah.
specialized to Gatsby previews, right? Like, and that doesn't fit our philosophy, but we are exploring the same primitive as like spinning up a long running dev server process where our system
Yeah.
will be smart in managing when it needs to be rebooted because it wraps up enough memory and stuff like that. So it still needs to be something that's safe to like turn on and,
Kill.
and, and off at points, right? Like,
Yeah.
but it, but would something like that help, or is it a different kind of primitive you're after?
No. Absolutely. I mean, for the use case I
Yeah,
defined, it's just that it's a
yeah,
process that you
yeah,
know it's just a big for loop of
yeah,
requests per rate limit to the X API,
yeah,
and so this will finish at some point. I just don't know
yeah,
when, but I'd like
yeah,
it to finish
yeah,
and then scale to zero, as opposed to being
mm,
killed at the
yeah,
15th
yeah,
second.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's interesting. Definitely a space that our sort of primitives team are looking at.
Nice. That's yeah, and if there's one company that I know keeps innovating in this space, it's Netlify. So I thought it wise to get it in front of you. I think the Daytona is a company that is doing sort of this because they're doing code spaces
Yeah,
as long running processes, but I think it's an entirely
yeah,
I think
yeah,
this may be a little bit apples to oranges. Okay. You mentioned guides and articles to achieve more with frameworks and
yeah,
runtimes.
yeah,
These are human written, but you talk a lot about UI 2.0 and the application of
yeah,
AI.
yeah,
I'm wondering if there's, and so okay, let me preface this by saying I absolutely love the explain this log to me feature that
yeah,
Netlify has recently shipped. I'm wondering if there's capacity for some type of AI feature where it's like instead of writing a guide to get the most out of Astro and to
mm,
do incremental ISR, there's a AI feature that the site I'm deploying because you're connected to my GitHub. Here's how you do it. Like I'll just open a pull request for you. Yeah,
yeah.
could we maybe speak to all of that, starting with the concept of UI 2.0 as you envision, and then go from there?
Yeah. This is absolutely something we're thinking a lot about, and I would say, in general, when I think about like when I think about AI and Netlify, there's first like four categories where we are strategic about it. The first one is like how do we actually use AI internally to increase our productivity. The second
Yeah,
one is how do we help developers build um, apps or services on top of different AI APIs, right? Like the third one is like how can we make Netlify's product better for our customers by using AI? And then the fourth category is in how does Netlify fit into the new world of AIs building and deploying and so on, right? Like um,
Devin.
Devin, for example, right? Like, so Devin just came out as a new like AI developer, right? Like, and
Yeah,
by default will deploy to Netlify. We also have a Netlify GPT in OpenAI's GPT store. Um, but even more so, that GPT, like that way of integrating, can be integrated into any GPT, and when you're using if you're anywhere in OpenAI's sort of platform, you can just, if you've installed our
yeah.
GPT, you can just say add Netlify and say, hey, deploy what you just did to Netlify, and it'll work, right? Like we're seeing like about 1,000 new sites getting created from OpenAI every day, right? Like
Oh
it's
my
pretty crazy.
gosh.
obviously it's still very much hobby projects and so on, right? Like, but I think we should expect over time more and more of this kind
Yeah.
of agent ecosystem being like things that interact with our systems, right? Like, um, now for number 3 and 2, like for the 2 and 3, right? Like, how do we help developers build new AI powered services, and how do we make Netlify better from AI? There's like 2 pieces to that. There's like, how do we, and that's what most people are focused on now, is like, how do we build the same kind of thing we've been building for the last 10 years,
Yeah.
but faster with the help of AI, right?
Mm.
Then the other question is, what things that we just couldn't build the last 10 years will AI allow us to build that will be fundamentally different, and how can we help people build those things, right? Like, and those are sort of 2 different categories, with some intersection, right? Like, and obviously from where we do the most feature investment first, I'm very much looking for the thing that will serve both, right? Like the things that will last and that will always be helpful, right? Like, so the deploy diagnostics we launched is kind of like one example of that will just always be useful, and where we can really
Yes.
see integrating the fact that we sit in between like logs and deployments and your code and so on, right? Like, to be able to have language models just really help you, and also to get
Yeah.
away from I think like the sort of chat based UIs. We have a feature called Ask Netlify that's integrated into our forums, our docs, and our internal support guides, where you can just go to our docs and plop a question in, and it'll answer, right? Like,
Nice.
but I think most of the time, chat based UIs is not like, people don't really want to go somewhere and ask freeform
Yeah.
questions. Like, people want
Yeah.
products to feel more productized like that, right? Like, people want
Yes.
to have products have an opinion of how to do things and so on, right? Like, so
Yeah.
I think,
Or the people want products to do the thing for them. Like I
or
don't want
do
to
the
add
thing for
next on
them, right?
Netlify. I want
Yeah,
you to add next on Netlify for me. Right.
precisely, right? Like, so I think that's where we see a lot of opportunity to extend on what we're doing with the deploy diagnostics, right? Like, of really having, like, using the knowledge we have of the full
Yeah.
system to make these tools just help you, and help you very organically, right? Like, we see a lot of, like, we're exploring a lot of opportunities also of just like, what can we do to shorten the time from writing code or from writing content or for anything, and to having it live on the web, right? Like, that's always been our core DNA, right? Like, how do we help people ship faster, right? Like,
Yeah.
so this was such an obvious blocker, right? Like, what's one of the biggest blockers that happens when you're working with our system? Well, it's like a build failed, and now you got to
Yes.
figure out why, right? Like, so it's like an obvious place to start and say, can we shorten
Yeah.
that time from build fails to I figured out why, and now I'm moving on with my life, and I've
Yeah.
got stuff live in production, right? Like, so
Yeah.
anywhere where we can see that there's like things that are holding back people from
Hmm.
writing their code or writing their content into actually having it out on a URL in front of customers, that's where we think we can build functionalities that
Yeah.
will shorten that path.
That's so cool. That's the sacred path of Netlify. That's what we're calling
Yeah.
that here on the podcast.
Yeah.
I like that we're speculating a bit and dreaming a little bit about this future. So what I'm hearing is the alpha version. So
Yeah.
the pre-release version of this feature is sure deploy diagnostics.
Yeah.
That's great, but the evolution of this is not just deploy diagnostics, but deploy pull requests. Probably like I found the issue. Here's am I leaking things? Am I not supposed to talk about this? I feel like if I can
No,
deduce
no.
this, probably others
I
will.
mean, it's all the things we're speculating, right? Like, and piercing around, like, what can we do in that area where we sit to just like reduce the friction. Um,
Yeah.
totally, totally.
Awesome.
Um,
Wow. I can't wait. I can't wait for that. When that lands, that's going to be a killer
and
feature
you'll
for
see it
sure.
in many places. Like, if you use our Slack integration, for example, we have a Slack app you can install where you can subscribe, like you can add it to a channel, subscribe to any kind of notification on like new build logs, new things. That was the first one to also get an integration into Ask Netlify. So you can just ask, if you actually ask a question to that Netlify bot, it will use AI to come up. Like if you're asking it, hey, how do I actually write what's the
Right.
signature for a Netlify function? It'll just reply to you in Slack and explain to you how that is straight
And
up.
the basis for adding knowledge to these LLM based features, I'm assuming it's probably something like Claude or GPT-4
Yeah,
behind the scenes. The
yeah.
strategy for fine tuning this for Netlify is that just RAG, like retrieval augmented generation, where you add context and
It,
say
it
it.
it varies a bit based on the use case. Obviously, like for the sort of Ask Netlify use case, it's more of a RAG, and for the Unfairify, it's more reliant on context right now, right? Like, but that's something that the team is working on, like is experimenting with and building internal tooling around, like how do we best
Yeah.
make these models efficient at answering, not just answering, but at helping generating solutions to the kind of problems that our customers have.
Mm. The feature of deploy diagnostics has been out for a while now. It's been pretty well
Yeah,
received. I'm
yeah.
curious about the other side of well received. Meaning, are there people going like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! You're violating my privacy here. What is this? Are you using this
We
for like training your other systems?"
we're not, and we've done a lot of like our head
I'm
of
not just to
legal.
clarify. I'm not asking that, but I'm wondering if people are
No, 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 and
sort
it's
of
it's really, I mean, it's something that we really took seriously internally, right? Like our head of legal, she's Rachel Tobin. She's really specializing a lot in the privacy policies around AI and so on right now, and also giving some talks about it and so on, right? Like and it's also really make sure that internally, like our agreements with any AI vendor and our agreement with customers are really centered around like making sure that people can trust the
yeah.
privacy aspects of it. There's also like controls in the app to decide, like you can disable or like you can prevent your team from using this feature if you have any, like as a company, have any restrictions around this and so on.
Yeah.
And currently we're like the data is not used for retraining any model right now. I wouldn't rule out that at some point in the future we might have an opt-in
Right.
to
And,
let us
and probably
use
do it
data
anonymously,
train.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But we would, like, if we were ever gonna ask you for data that we would use to train anything with, we would ask for explicit permission, obviously.
Good. Good. I'm so glad you clarified that because I know there's always with features like this there's always skeptics.
Yeah.
I, for example, gosh man, I saw Google Chrome. I think it's in Canary, right? This
Yeah, yeah,
autofill but AI feature.
yeah, yeah.
And I don't. I'm all for AI. I live in Europe, so I'm all for AI regulation, and I don't think that's necessarily bad. But when you bring something like that to the native browser UI, I don't know. It just for whatever reason rubbed me the wrong way, and I'm still talking to a therapist about it. But anyway, without
Abs-
digressing too much, I'd love to start to wrap up our discussion, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a question. This is not so technical, but you mentioned when I asked you about being, should founders code or should CEOs code, you mentioned there's no rule book. And indeed, there is no rule book, but I think there should be one. And so on the show, every time I have CEOs or founders, I'm asking if you've done this for a while. You're not a first time founder because you had BitBalloon and other things. You're probably not also a first time CEO because of that. You've had a few trips around the CEO circus.
yeah.
Um, what if there was to be a document, like a formal document, like this is the CEO charter, right? This is
Mhm.
the manifesto of being a. What would you add to that? What is something that maybe I'll ask it differently? Like if there's a first time founder, first time CEO listening to this, what's an important tenet of the job that ought not be missed?
I mean, the first thing is that it changes so much, like along the journey, right? Like that's a big difference between a founder CEO and a professional CEO. That any professional CEO will typically have sort of a like a set of life cycles of a company that they're
Yeah.
that they will be brought in to run, and it would be a very different CEO they would bring in if you needed a new CEO for an early stage company versus if you're looking for a CEO for a large publicly traded company. And somehow the founder CEO is somehow supposed to go through that whole journey and fill this CEO role at all these different stages, right? Like, so you got to be willing to learn a lot and change a lot in what your role encompasses and what the role is. Um, that's one of the first things just for founder CEO, right? Like,
Yeah.
because like the question of should write code, well, when you're 3 people, you better, right? If you can. When
Yeah.
you're a large publicly traded company, it's probably not like
Yeah.
the thing that makes the biggest difference to the
Yeah.
business, what code you write it individually, right? Like,
Yeah.
so you should always think about from where my company is now, what's the way that what I can do has the highest leverage for the business.
Yeah.
You should always try to know what the one really big thing you're trying to get done is, and try to see, are you actually able to apply your time to getting that thing done,
Mhm.
whatever it is. um the more you go from the early stages of being hands-on with the team to the later stages of leading a larger organization, the more important it becomes that you really try to train yourself in creating clarity and simplifying,
Yeah.
because it's really like one of the hardest things is just aligning an organization around a few clear goals, and give people the clarity of knowing where they can, how they can best impact the business.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, listen, Matt, it's been such a pleasure. Look, it's not lost on me that you're the CEO of probably $1 billion company, or at least $100 million company, and you've got a schedule, you've got places to be, things to do, customers to close, support to give. I do not take this lightly that you'd come on this podcast and really share so much wisdom of Netlify then and now and Bitbucket, and even get into the nitty gritty of the CDN that was built at Netlify, deploy previews, and looking to the future with AI. On behalf of me and the listeners, I just want to thank you profoundly for your contributions to the podcast and to the tech industry at large.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a lot of fun.
Thank you for joining my discussion with Matt Biilmann. I hope you found it as insightful and wonderful, frankly, as I have. I hope you learned to appreciate Netlify more, because it protects you when you have that moment as a founder, this huge traffic spike with DDoS protection that's not overly eager. I hope you got to see the humility and humanity of the people who run Netlify, aka Matt, who's just a developer like us, who actually loves the craft, from his descriptions geeking out on the GitHub workflow and Merkle trees and things like that. And I really hope you've developed an appreciation and a sort of a looking forward for the next features that are coming with the why did this deploy fail AI features and more. If you're learning from and or enjoying this content, I'd invite you to like this video if you're watching on YouTube and subscribe to the channel. Or if you're listening on Apple and Spotify, leave up to a 5-star review. This really does help make the podcast discoverable, but more than that, it's a signal to me of whether this is actually valuable and whether it's worth doing more of. I certainly am not interested in spending time on this if nobody's benefiting from it. And so if you are, share that with me as a signal that you are. If you really want to go the extra mile, I'd encourage you to share this on social media. That would be probably a huge signal, because that says, hey, not only do I like this, I think you like this to your friends as well. Okay. Next week, we've got the one, the only CEO founder of Vercel, Guillermo Rauch. Guillermo Rauch. It's one of those names, like mine, Tejas, Contagious. Anyway, Guillermo's going to come on, talk about Vercel, building Vercel, how it works, what's next. Can you just get by with a VPS? We talk about dark fiber and all kinds of interesting technical terms, and we go deep into the physics of networking and so on and so forth. So I'd encourage you to subscribe for that. But that's on Monday. On Thursday, we're talking to Jeff Escalante, the director of engineering at Clerk. Jeff has been an engineering leader for years. I'll save the intro for that episode, but I encourage you also stick around for Jeff. He's an absolute institution of a leader, and I can't wait to hear from you how much value you got out of that episode and this one. For now, thank you for joining the podcast. Thank you for being a part of it, and thank you for your interest in software and web engineering.